Welcome, and thank you for joining today's webinar titled Drug Trials and Tribulations, Reflections on Equity and Access. My name is Adrienne Simmons, and I'm the Director of Programs at the National Viral Hepatitis Roundtable. This webinar is being hosted by the Hepatitis B Foundation and NVHR. To learn more about our organizations, you can visit our websites using the links in the chat. This webinar will provide an overview of the hepatitis B and hepatitis delta clinical trial experience as it relates to access and equity. This webinar is part 2 of a 2-part series intended for patients, advocates, and other stakeholders who are interested in learning more about the clinical trial process before participating in the AASLD liver meeting or other advocacy opportunities in the future. We're thrilled to be joined by a diverse group of experts today. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I would like to remind all participants that during today's webinar, all audience members will be muted. We encourage you to use the chat function to let us know who you are and where you're joining from. If you have any technical challenges, please send a message to the host and panelists using the chat box. At any time during the presentation, you can enter questions into the Q&A box. Questions will be addressed by the speakers at the end of the webinar. Lastly, this session is being recorded and slides will be shared following the webinar. Next slide, please. At this time, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Rico Boone. Rico is the HIV Project Director with Treatment Action Group, where he manages HIV research advocacy, community engagement around HIV, COVID-19, and monkeypox, as well as supporting the implementation of the Act Now End AIDS Coalition. Rico is also a PhD candidate in applied social psychology at George Washington University, where his research focuses on diversity and inclusion of Black sexual and gender minorities in HIV cure and COVID-focused research. Rico will be laying the foundation for today's webinar on clinical trial access and equity, drawing from lessons learned in HIV research. Rico, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Am I all set here?
You are all set. Your video is not on yet, but your slides look great.
Awesome. Great. There we go. Hello, everybody. So thank you. I am a pleasure to be here today. Today I'm going to be speaking about 50 years plus of inaccessible miracles and inequitable access to clinical trials, particularly drawing lessons from HIV prevention, vaccine, and cure research. So if we were in person, I would do this quick kind of pop quiz and just see how out of 55-mile-long AIDS memorial quilt, how many miles are represented by tiles memorializing people of color. I think many folks would be surprised to hear that that number is 2 miles out of the 55 miles. And if we're kind of drill down and specifically talk about how many miles are represented by Black people, it's 1 mile. So I think that's a great way to start to talk in terms of kind of representing the analogy that this is really for biomedical prevention and representation in biomedical HIV prevention, cure, and vaccine research. The title of my talk actually comes from a 1999 report by my colleague, Dr. Lisa Boleg, my mentor and colleague, Dr. Lisa Boleg, when she was working at the Center for Women Policy Studies in DC. And specifically, the report focused in on why, Black women were underrepresented. Women and women of color, Black women were underrepresented in clinical trial research, and also the reasons why they had inequitable access to antiviral medications that were coming out. And so, in that report, they specifically cited that, women and men of color are less likely to know about new HIV/AIDS drugs or be informed that they're eligible to participate in clinical trials. And this was true in 1997 and certainly rings true even today. So one of the other things that they found was that fewer than 75 women participated in initial clinical trials that FDA approved protease inhibitors, and this was in 1996. How far have we come? We'll get to that. So basically what they were charged to do is they set out to kind of, find out why Black women in Washington, D.C., the DMV area, were not having access to medications. And so They surveyed 82 women, and out of the 82 women, you see that the sample was predominantly Black women, and not Hispanic Black, that is. And, out of the sample, the women reported that 28% of the women reported that they had not ever participated in clinical trials, or that they had participated in clinical trials, sorry. When asked why they had not participated in clinical trials, 51% reported that they had no information about it, right? And then kind of focusing on some individual level factors, there was lack of interest, not wanting to be experimented upon, not wanting to provide personal information, fear of adverse side effects, et cetera, right? And then they also found that the women whose doctors informed them about clinical trials, actually, the majority of those women actually did participate in the trials. So, I want to kind of walk us through a timeline here of kind of the advances in biomedical prevention. So, we know that in 2012, the first drug for HIV prevention, pre-exposure prophylaxis, was approved. And in the press release for that, they noted that although the implementation of PrEP will bring challenges, quote, they can be anticipated and systems developed to address these challenges. Unfortunately, that has not really come to pass, and so we're still trying to address these challenges. Then in October 2019, we saw the approval of the second drug for HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis. And unfortunately, because people assigned female at birth were not included in those trials, the drug was not indicated for individuals at risk of HIV infection from receptive vaginal sex. And some work has been done to resolve that issue, but this was the initial problem. Then in December 2021, we saw the third regimen for pre-exposure prophylaxis approved by the FDA, cabotegravir, a new and exciting injectable form. And so TAG, this is just an excerpt from TAG's statement on that, saying that we must immediately and fully scale up additional intervention studies, demonstration projects, and social behavioral science studies that address these unique barriers to access for all major vulnerable populations. And then fast forward 1 year later, we have reached the 10-year anniversary of the first drug approved for pre-exposure prophylaxis for PrEP. And so I want to bring attention to a colleague here, his statement, excellent article in POZ magazine, where he says, we've seen what happens in 10 years since the promise of prevention was made. We must admit, however, that PrEP, when it comes to PrEP, we have failed the most affected communities, further building the divide between the haves and the have-nots. So why is that so? And this is just an example of some of the disparities that we see. We know PrEP coverage is not equal, and the disparities must be addressed to reach all those who could benefit equitably. So here we see disparities as it relates to sex at birth and age, and then also race, where we see that by and large, the vast majority of PrEP users have been white. And this is from data from Dr. Dimitri Daskalakis, courtesy of him from the CDC. So just kind of, rewinding back again, thinking about the first treatment trials for HIV, we have AZT. We know that women were underrepresented in those trials. And then the same thing is true for vaccine trials, unfortunately. So this is a 2021 article by Flores and colleagues, where they showed that when it comes to race and ethnicity, by and large, the same remains to be true. They looked at studies from 219,000 studies covering pretty much a decade or so of vaccine trials. And out of the 219,000 participants, 75% of those trial participants were white. And they looked at 230 US-based trials where they found this to be true. The analysis also found that patterns of racial disparities are consistent across trial phases. So I want to bring attention to the fact that this is true for phase 1 trials, phase 2 trials, and phase 3 trials. And if we think about phase 1 efficacy, safety trials, behavioral risk we know is an exclusion criteria for many of these trials. So people who are at high risk, quote unquote, of behavioral risk, that is, of contracting or acquiring HIV, are commonly excluded from these trials. And so we know that the HVTN, HIV Vaccine Trials Network, is currently kind of looking at considerations of relaxing some of these strict exclusion criteria, because we know that that has, it undermines diversity, equity, and inclusion in HIV vaccine research. Also want to bring your attention to the fact of older populations also being underrepresented in trials as well. So, often we think about the individual level factors that undermine equity, but we also have to think about these kind of larger structural level factors as well that affect inclusion, particularly, for instance, structural racism and implicit bias. And so bringing attention here to two studies that were released in 2022, showing that in electronic health records, doctors were more likely to describe their Black patients using kind of, pejorative or, negative loaded terms, right? Like, resistant, non-compliant, non-adherent, those sort of things, right? And so, if we think about, people being referred by their medical providers for clinical trials that often require, strict adherence to protocols, et cetera, begs the question then, are these implicit biases playing out in medical provider referrals to clinical trials? So don't have to, I'm speaking to the choir here with this crowd. We know that, every 30 seconds a person dies from hepatitis-related illness, and 1 million newborns are infected with hepatitis B annually. And so, we also want to look at the kind of geographic distribution of HIV as well. So this is just a map here showing that, by and large, majority of cases are in, sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world. But when we look at the geographic distribution of HIV cure-related studies, we see that the majority are conducted in the United States. So my colleague, Richard Jeffries, and other colleague, Elizabeth Barr, have been looking at demographics of HIV cure research for the past several years. And so, what we see here is a kind of overview of studies, 122 cure studies covering 2018 to most recently October 22. And this kind of, more easily depicts the data here, where we see that by and large, the majority of these HIV cure studies have samples that are majority male. And as far as race ethnicity, we also see that the majority, about half, are white folks involved in these studies as well. So there is suboptimal, nearly non-existent transgender, non-binary participation and representation in cure trials. And then we also see that Black people represent only about 22% of HIV cure studies. Definitely a big problem. Some other colleagues and myself, we also did a review of HIV cure studies, preclinical studies and lab studies and also clinical trials, specifically focusing in on the year 2019, and studies funded by the NIH Martin Delaney Collaboratories for HIV cure research. And in our review, we looked at 104 publications, 55 of which included research that we considered to be on human participants. So, studies that involved either biosamples or human participants. And of the 55 publications, we saw that only about half included the distribution of at least one demographic variable, and only about less than half included information about the sex and gender of participants, and only 8 studies provided any data related to race ethnicity of human participants. And of those, only 5 of those studies actually had what we consider to be a diverse sample. So, the issue kind of spans HIV prevention, cure, and vaccine research of this, lack of representation. We saw that women were dramatically underrepresented. The data suggests that it's not due to individual level differences or screening out of eligibility. And like as I said, data on race and ethnicity was underreported, and when reported, diversity was suboptimal. We saw the same things play out in COVID clinical trials as well. So, by and large, folks of color were underrepresented in the initial trials. And, however, there were some sites that were successful at recruiting Black and Latino people into the studies. And so here we just see kind of an overview of, all of the vaccine trials that were done, and we can see the distribution here, which we know does not necessarily match the initial, these patterns of folks who were contracting COVID and dying from COVID. So here we have a timeline of some policy considerations for HIV vaccine prevention and cure-related research. I won't go through all of these. However, just point out that in 1993, that's where we saw the NIH Revitalization Act requiring strengthening of inclusion guidelines. In 2016, we saw the sex as a biological variable policy go into effect, expecting that sex as a biological variable will be factored into research designs, analyses, and reporting. And then in 2020, a couple of things happened. So in 2020, we know the FDA released its guidance for industry. So enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations, eligibility criteria, enrollment practices, and trial design guidance for industry. So that's one important thing that happened in 2020. The second thing that happened in 2020 was the Omnibus spending and relief package. So this package, little known secret that I discovered, required that Medicaid, any kind of costs associated with clinical trial enrollment and participation be covered for the first time by Medicaid. So, there were some federal level policies that, kind of allowed for participation and coverage of clinical trial costs. However, Medicaid beneficiaries were initially excluded from those federal measures. And so, with the 2020 release package, that changed. And not too many people may know about that. Also, recently we see the Improving Representation in Clinical Trials and Research report issued by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And that report outlines, all the reasons that, diversity and inclusion in research is important in the first place, right? So we know that, lack of representation compromises generalizability. It actually ends up costing hundreds of billions by not having trials diverse. It hinders innovation and discoveries, leads to a lack of access. All of these, issues compound health disparities as well. And there are probably, other implications or consequences as well. But the report also provided a list of facilitators for successful inclusion in the research. So, leading with intention, really kind of zeroing in and drilling down on trust, removing barriers whenever possible, anticipating those barriers, and implementing protocols that remove those barriers, adopting flexible approaches in terms of scheduling, and, all of these sort of, tactics that could be used to increase representation, but also optimizing the study team, right? And it really begins with, the principal investigators as well. If we're going to be focusing on maximizing inclusion in research, we got to start with the representation and diversity of principal investigators as well. So I just want to run down quickly, what is known about Black people's, for instance, willingness and intentions to participate in medical research or biomedical HIV research. So we went over the statistics from the Flores study showing that Black people are underrepresented in clinical trials. However, we know that Black people have altruistic motivations for clinical trial participation as well. Things like, social activism, perceived sense of inclusion and purpose are, factors that increase Black people's willingness to participate in, or are associated with Black people's willingness to participate in clinical trials. But often we talk about mistrust, right? Mistrust in medical research, is a thing. It has to be acknowledged and addressed. And mistrust in medical research is, rooted in real things that happened, even prior to Tuskegee, right? Tuskegee is often what we, kind of refer to, but then there's a long history of abuses, racism and racial discrimination, inequitable medical treatment, experimentation on Black people and enslaved people. And so, we have to acknowledge that, lack of participation or, mistrust in research is, rooted in these things, this history. But it may also be rooted in the perception that, Black people or, people who don't look like me, don't look like, the person who, is considering participating in the trial, aren't sufficiently represented in the leadership of research projects. And so we also know that evidence is mixed about the role of medical mistrust in shaping Black people's behaviors, whereas some studies show that mistrust actually does undermine participation. There are other studies that don't show these associations, and I'm going to walk through some data from a project that I lead as well that shows that. And then we also know that methods of measuring mistrust vary across studies. So, not every study or paper or, research project is actually measuring mistrust in the same way or assessing mistrust in the same way. So, with that, we know that, overall, the science to date suggests that mistrust, quote unquote, is not merely the opposite of trust, right, or the absence of trust. Mistrust actually often signifies the belief that an entity is acting against one's best interests, right, or well-being. And so this is just some data from a small pilot study that I am doing for my dissertation. And so we looked at factors associated with Black sexual minority men's participation in biomedical HIV research. And I presented this at the 2021 INMAC Biomedical Research Summit. And so we surveyed 90 Black, gay, bisexual, and other sexual minority men who were PrEP naive and also HIV negative. The average age of the sample was 32, so fairly young group. 25% of the sample actually reported some medical research participation prior, which was pretty large for this group. And we also saw that 49% of people reported knowing someone living with HIV. And so when we looked at mistrust, however, we saw some interesting things, right? So just in bivariate associations, we saw that, racial ethnic salience, so the degree to which, someone's race or ethnicity was like a core identity or of their, their persona and their identity, kind of the salience of their race and ethnicity had a bivariate association with mistrust. So, the higher people were in their racial ethnic salience, they were more mistrustful. And I won't go through the measure that we used, but it was called the Trust in Medical Research Scale. And I can share that information, but I think it's in the references if you're interested. We also saw, kind of contrary to what might be expected, that younger people actually scored higher on the mistrust scale. And so, you would think that, okay, older people who are more aware of, the atrocities and whatnot that have happened in the past, that they might score higher. And we actually saw the opposite, and we certainly saw that play out with COVID. And then we saw no multivariable associations with clinical trial participation, intentions, or interests. And so also, speaking to the crowd, speaking to the quiet here, this is a survey that was put out by, Jasmine Abraham on the call, and at the foundation where they surveyed 771 people, and this was from 2022. And 6-month survey, and they showed that by and large, there are also there's some positive attitudes towards participation in clinical trials for hepatitis B, right? And so I love this because you see the differences between U.S.-based folks and international-based folks, and you can see the international-based folks were pretty much across the board, race in terms of race, white, Black, Asian, et cetera, were more interested or willing to participate in clinical trials. And then you also see here, though, that within the U.S., you do see some differences by race. So in thinking, going through some lessons learned, just to wrap up here, we know that, there have been far too many inaccessible miracles, right? So when we look at the cost of drugs that are approved, even the most recent approved injectable drug for HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis, cost puts things too far out of people's reach. And that continues to be a pattern over and over and over and over again. When will it end? We also know that individual differences alone, so mistrust, for instance, don't account for the disparities in access to clinical trials. So we got to, move beyond Tuskegee, thinking about, trust in a different way, realizing that mistrust is not a panacea, and that, clinical trial research should be informed by intersectionality. so that intersectionality kind of informed lens has to begin even in the preclinical phase. If we're thinking about, the samples that, folks are using to assess, products, from that point all the way to the clinical trial participation, there needs to be a focus on kind of thinking about diversity and equity inclusion. I won't go into, this in great depth, but, I welcome you to, do some research on intersectionality, which really shows that, it's a theoretical framework that should inform how we approach community engagement in biomedical cure research. And for hepatitis B, for hepatitis Z, HIV, for all things. And so the whole idea is that, we experience oppressions based on our social position, but not just oppressions, we also experience privileges based on our social positions. And so thinking about, immigration status, socioeconomic position, but also these interlocking systems of oppression. So racism, sexism, all of these things kind of impact the participation of people in clinical trials, whether or not they have access to clinical trials. So thinking about power and privilege and the role that these things play in determining who has access to this information. Here's just another example of, some outcomes that really show that, Black people are, less likely to benefit from some of these things that are in the biomedical pipeline due to kind of, physiological differences that have to be acknowledged, right, and really assessed. And, this is the reason why we need more representation. There also needs to be more social and behavioral sciences and playing a role in advancing and accelerating biomedical intervention pipelines. We discussed this already. Addressing equity begins with the preclinical phase. We have to leverage policies for increased access to clinical trials. And, we know based on history, recent history with COVID, that when there is a, kind of social, political, and fiscal will, there's certainly a way, right? We can overcome this. So I'll leave you with some references, and I think that is all I have. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rico. You've given us a lot to think about, and I'm looking forward to unpacking some of this with our panel and during the Q&A. We're grateful to you and the broader HIV community for these insights. As a reminder, if folks have questions, please pop them into the Q&A box. Next, we're going to hear from a panel of experts. So panelists, please show me on video as I introduce you. Reverend Jason Crum is a minister and a person living with hepatitis B, as well as a community advocate for people living with HIV and hepatitis B. He's a proud Hepatitis B Foundation storyteller. Dr. Lee Holland is a patient advocate, a pharmacist, and the manager of medical writing at Exogene, where she develops plain language documents and works to increase health literacy around clinical trials. And then finally, Dr. Tatiana Kushner is a gastroenterologist and an associate professor in the Division of Liver Diseases at Mount Sinai, where she focuses on viral hepatitis, women, and pregnancy. Next slide, please. So this panel is going to be moderated by Dr. Yasmin Ibrahim. Yasmin is a senior public health program manager at the Hepatitis B Foundation, and she currently leads a study on improving diversity of participants in hepatitis B clinical trials, hoping to increase access for people living with hepatitis B and to increase representation in clinical trials. So for the next 15 minutes, I'm looking forward to a rich discussion among our panelists. And at this point, Yasmin, I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adrienne, and thank you, Rico, for this great information. And I would like to start by discussing the overall picture of, despite the FDA guidance that you've mentioned that was released in 2020, there is still not a lot of regulatory atmosphere or framework that requires outreach to efforts to diverse population groups, minorities, and this has contributed to the high numbers of white participants and trials in disease areas that are predominantly impacting those minority populations, sometimes up to 80% white participants. And this has gone for years, as you've shown. How can we improve this from multiple perspectives, including the long-lasting practice by the pharma of of choosing the principal investigators and how these principal investigators are always in urban, large institutions settings?
So I could try to answer that. I think with clinical trials, as a clinician, I see different stakeholders, different people that are involved. Obviously, it starts with the patient. Then there are the principal investigators or the medical providers, and then there's industry who may be sponsoring the clinical trials. So I think to start, it does have to be patient-centric. So we need to be better at really spreading awareness of not just clinical trials, but the disease and what treatments are available and what's in the pipeline. And how do we do that? I think efforts such as is done with the Hepatitis B Foundation in terms of really engaging people living with these conditions in discussions about what we know and what we're learning and the research ongoing in programs such as community advisory boards, for example, where you have meetings with the community along with the medical providers, along with industry, along with patient advocates, all together in the same room discussing updates in the field. And then I also think that in terms of, this idea of where these clinical trials are being done, I agree, a lot of them are done at these large academic health centers with principal investigators that are the principal investigators on all of the clinical trials. So I think there needs to be some kind of regulation that says that if you are a principal investigator of one hepatitis B clinical trial, then maybe the next clinical trial run by that same industry should occur elsewhere to at least try to broaden the population that can access these clinical trials. And then in terms of, once you have the clinical trial, recruitment of people to participate, as the clinical person, as the investigator on the clinical trial, you really need to make an effort to find people that are not all the same type of person, and to, if they're not aware of it, make sure that you can let the patients that you are seeing know about these clinical trials. And if they have hesitancy in the beginning, spend the time to try to educate them about the potential benefits.
Thanks, Tatiana. Lee, did you have anything to add?
Yes, one thing I think is really important that I think you kind of touched on. A lot of clinical trials are in urban centers. So as a result, I think one thing that people forget about is that rural communities, people in rural communities really get left out. And I know predominantly people think that rural means, like conservative, and that's not the case. There are vast communities of color in rural areas, especially in the southeastern United States and in the western US, where we have indigenous and Native American populations here in the southeastern United States. And we have large Black rural populations, and also Asian populations as well, especially along the Gulf Coast. So I think it's very important that when we're thinking about different things that impact clinical trial access, we have to look into the rural component as well, because those are some really underserved communities that are also being hit by healthcare provider shortages. There's not enough doctors and nurses there.
Thank you. Jason, through your own personal experience, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, well, access to patients is much easier today than it was in 1991. I agree with Dr. Kushner that, CAB meetings are an excellent source. And also to piggyback on that, and I know in New York they have, it's called HIV-centered adult day healthcare centers, and which is for people with HIV who generally don't have anything to do or what have you, to hang out where they learn about their condition, they learn about addiction, they learn about different things, and they, where they also have healthcare there as well. And so that, and I think that those two right there in New York City are really great places to get access to patients to participate in these trials, or to get the information to the patients.
Great. You've actually touched upon a very important point, which is reaching the patients where they really are, which brings actually an important question, which is awareness about clinical trials among even healthcare providers, especially primary care physicians and federally qualified health clinics, community clinics, and other practices. These providers are the most trusted ones by the patients. They build long and lasting and strong relationship with the patients. And so how can we really potentiate and improve the role of PCPs in referral or even participating in part of the clinical trial within this context?
I think that, oh, sorry. No, go ahead, doctor.
I just wanted to echo that I very much agree that patients, when they have a long-standing relationship with their primary care provider, they will look to them to decide what, even if they know about a clinical trial, whether they would move forward with participating. So I agree that involving their primary care providers is important. How to do that? Again, I think it's finding ways to more broadly disseminate information on a city level, on a community level, to make sure that they're really aware of what option, what trials are running and open.
I also think that, like with me, I learned how to, when I want to know what trials were available, I learned how to go onto Mount Sinai. I forget the name of it, but they have a clinical trial database within their institution, and you can search for what trials are available, and it'll tell you with the inclusion and exclusion, if you qualify, if you don't qualify. And I participated in a number of those trials. And a good relationship with your doctor is excellent. When I moved back to Kansas, I live back in New York now, but when I moved back to Kansas and I had questions about my HBV and my HIV too, as well. I mean, my doctor in infectious disease was Dr. Michael Geiser, and my doctor for hepatitis was Puni Paraswamy. And I hadn't seen him in a while, and I had basically been sort of like, I guess you could say, discharged from their care. But they were still willing to see me because they knew me and I knew them. And I wanted to get some, after being mistreated back home from bad doctors, I was able to come for a day. I flew from Kansas to New York to see them too. And they were able to see me, and they were able to and give me some good information about my care and how to get even better care, through the NIH, for their trials and what have you. And so, yeah, a good doctor is a relationship is just as important. But just to clarify that, I think that the doctor-patient relationship should never be one-sided. It should be, equal on both sides. The patient must be proactive, because the doctor is a human. The doctor is just a doctor, and they can't do everything. So the patient must be adherent, and the patient must be trying to do something to better their health care, as far as the individual themselves, and don't put everything on the doctor.
Thanks, Jason. Lee?
Yeah, Jason, thank you so much for sharing that, because you touched on so much that is so incredibly important. You're correct, doctors are humans. They certainly make mistakes. I previously have done some research into access to medical care, and prejudices on the parts of doctors can be devastating, absolutely devastating. I'm going to kind of suggest something. We're talking about federally, funded healthcare centers, and we're talking about PCPs. Well, I'm a PharmD, so I have to speak as a pharmacist here. Pharmacists are the most accessible healthcare provider in the United States. A lot of people don't realize the person behind the counter in your pharmacy has a doctor of pharmacy degree. They're responsible for being sure that your medications are safe. Well, one thing that we're beginning to see more of, which I'm really excited about, is that pharmacies are becoming clinical trial sites. You know, the big pharmacies, Walgreens, CVS, and Walmart just recently announced that they're getting into the clinical trial space where you can go to your pharmacy and be part of a clinical trial. Now, that is all great for places that have chain pharmacies. Once again, those urban and suburban areas. Independent pharmacies, you know, small family-owned pharmacies that you tend to find more in rural areas. There's been movement to kind of get them involved. There's organizations like RxE2 that is looking to get these independent pharmacies that are more likely to be in rural areas as sites to help expand access. Once again, getting to those rural communities that are surprisingly diverse, despite what people on the East and West Coast think of what rural America looks like.
Thank you so much, Lee. And as we are on the point of like reaching out to the patients where they are, as we all know, COVID-19 pandemic really potentiated and augmented and gave credibility to decentralized clinical trials. What are those exactly, and how do they help overcome some of the challenges and the costs participants in clinical trials may encounter, and how could these be a step forward in the future? And the challenges.
Decentralized clinical trials, the concept is that people can take part in clinical trials without having to be close to one of those big urban medical centers. So you can go to your PCP's office, you can go to a pharmacy, or maybe it's all done through telehealth. The concept is that will get more people into clinical trials and give them more access to some of these cutting edge treatments that are being researched. However, we have to be very, very careful because there's what's called the digital divide. Remember, I was at a conference not too long ago and everybody's like, oh, most Americans have smartphones. Well, that's great, wonderful. However, how many people know how to use their smartphones, especially, you know, with elderly folks? Also, there's situation of having basically data access. For instance, I have family members living in rural portions of Appalachia that can't get high-speed internet service in their homes. It's not available. So decentralized clinical trials have a lot of potential, but we can't think that they're going to just cure all problems to clinical trial access. That's something that we have to keep in mind, is the challenges that people are still going to face, and be realistic about those.
Thanks, Lee. Tatiana or Jason, would you like to comment on that?
I think that, you know, I forgot to mention earlier, I think that, you know, they should have access to clinical trials in, you know, kiosk in every neighborhood, especially the urban neighborhoods where the Black and browns and yellows live. Because 9 times out of 10, a lot of them it's not that healthcare is not available. A lot of them won't go because they have in their mind everything is okay. They don't need anything. And so I think that as we have put healthcare centers in some of these neighborhoods, these low poverty neighborhoods, high poverty neighborhoods, I'm sorry. I think that we should also put kiosks for clinical trials to give them better access and let them know that, okay, look, we're working on your condition. Or we use the term HIV, we're working on HIV, we're trying to find a cure. But in order for us to find a cure, we need your help. So put kiosks in the neighborhood. I know that's a little far-fetched, but if you're gonna put them in pharmacies, put them in the neighborhoods. You know, not that I'm against putting them in pharmacies. I think it's a wonderful idea, especially the mom and pops. But I mean, mom and pops mean independent. But I think putting them in the kiosk, putting the kiosk in the neighborhoods would be an excellent idea. And
I think that is an excellent thought, suggestion. I agree that there are many people that just hate the healthcare setting, that literally coming in and seeing someone in a white coat is just completely unappealing, and they just don't like that setting or don't want to go there to learn more about potential studies that these people are doing. I spoke to someone who's a researcher who was conducting studies actually in New Zealand, but he said when he tried to recruit patients, the method that worked the best is just putting an ad on the radio, not putting posters within the hospital or, in your clinical center. That won't do anything, but actually direct to the people that are affected. If you can tell them about these studies that may benefit them, and they can access them without having to go through this intensive healthcare experience, not for everyone, but for I think many people, would be definitely helpful to even learn about these clinical trials.
And if I could just piggyback on that, Jason, I think that is a wonderful idea. And I think there's another aspect that it could help as well, is there's a lot of stigma attached to certain diseases. Because I know, in some of the previous research that I've done, people don't even want to be seen at certain providers' offices or doctors' offices. So a kiosk that is, they could just go and they could just get information and make contact with the health system or with the clinical trial, whether it's urban or rural, anywhere, I think is an excellent idea. And I don't see why big pharma companies wouldn't cough up the money to create something like that. Because it could be about the size of a video game cabinet, old school video arcade games. So I think there's a lot of potential there that needs to be explored.
And just to piggyback off what you just said, I know patients back in the early days of my advocacy, where some patients don't want to see certain doctors in certain settings. Believe it or not, to this day, in rural areas, there are certain doctors that don't want to see certain patients. And in this day and age, it's really sad. So when we do put these clinical trials in some of the health centers, make sure that they're health centers that are equally accessible to every gender, regardless if it's binary or whatever, to every individual, regardless if they're Black, brown, yellow, Caucasian, or Chinese, Asian, Polynesian, it doesn't matter, to make sure that they're accessible to everyone, because there are still doctors' offices in rural areas that will not see someone because they are HIV or because they have hepatitis B, not because they don't know about it. It's because of the prejudice behind it.
Yes, and I could not agree more, because that's one thing that I think that we really have to tackle is, and this can really go off the rails, but medical training and who we are selecting for medical school, pharmacy school, nursing school. Okay, we got to go back to the root cause. Okay, we need to get real about admissions committees, and that's what I'm going to say, so we can focus back on clinical trials.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Tatiana, Lee, and Jason, for the great insights that you've shared with us. We have so many still questions, but Adrian, I'm aware of the time running, so I'll hand it back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. This was a really, really great discussion, and I wish we had more time, but I've heard a lot of great themes around racism, discrimination, xenophobia, homophobia, health literacy, the digital divide, geographic disparities, right? There's so much here to talk about. So you've heard about a lot of the challenges, and if we had more time, you'd probably hear about more. And so we're really going to wrap things up with, well, now that you've heard about the challenges, what do we actually do about them? Who can we be engaging with, particularly entities that are in charge of clinical trials, to help address some of these challenges? And so you're going to hear from our last speaker, Jeannie Ireland. Jeannie is a regulatory and health policy consultant who helps patient organizations and industry clients work more effectively with the Food and Drug Administration. We're closing out with a call to action. Jeannie, thanks so much for being with us today. Again, if folks have questions, please pop them into the chat. We're running a little bit behind on time, but we're happy to stay with you after the hour to answer any questions you may have. So thanks to our panelists, and Jeannie, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Adrienne, and thanks everyone for letting me be here this afternoon. I'm going to skip through my slides a little bit. They're here for you as a resource, but I know we're short on time. As Adrienne said, we'll take a pivot from the discussion we've heard so far. You know, lots of great insights, lots of challenges identified. So what I'm going to cover here, though, is what you do with that. If you want to bring your concerns, if you want to bring your ideas to FDA, what are the best ways to affect change with FDA? What are the best ways to advocate effectively? So next slide. As Adrienne mentioned, I've worked in and around FDA issues for many years, from the congressional committees that oversee FDA, some time at FDA, with a patient organization for several years. And in that time, I've seen the receptivity of the agency to patient organizations grow. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it's certainly grown. And I've seen the skill of patients and patient organizations really sharpen over that time. I will say, from having watched the chat and people's introductions as they were coming on, many of the opportunities I'm going to talk about are opportunities some of you have taken full advantage of, have leveraged already. And many of the successes I'm going to talk about are your successes. So I just want to acknowledge that. I do know that for some folks on these are newer topics, and so I hope this background is going to be helpful to you. So first off, what are FDA's roles in drug development and drug review? So it's important to understand that long before that application is submitted, FDA is working with the drug developer. They're trying to find the best ways to design a trial, to pick the right endpoints, to determine who should be in and out of a trial, all with a goal of reducing the time and the cost for the drug developer to bring that product to market, and also to ensure that the time and the personal costs of patients who've agreed to participate in that trial are really limited to those burdens that are truly necessary. They want to give a product the best chance of success, but also to identify as early as possible when to call it quits, so that time and energy and resources, both on the part of the patients and the developer, are not wasted. Let me skip down to the bottom bullet here. To help guide the process, to make it clear to stakeholders, patients, industry, others, what FDA's views are, what the rules of the road are, how best to get from point A to point B in developing a product for a specific condition, FDA develops what are called policy documents, known as guidances. This is something Rico mentioned in his discussion. I have one up here on the slide. That's a guidance that explains what some of the programs are, like accelerated approval and breakthrough, expedited programs for serious conditions. As Rico pointed out, there's also a draft guidance that's out around inclusion in clinical trials and trying to address some disparities. That's FDA's way again. And again, some of these relate to endpoints or to study design or to statistical methods, but it's FDA's way of putting its views out there. These are not binding on industry. They are suggestions to industry about pathways FDA believes could be most successful. And obviously, if you're a drug developer, you're going to take that very seriously, given that it represents FDA's thinking on the matter. Next slide. So FDA works within a broad framework, legal framework established by Congress that sets the parameters for which drugs can be approved and which ones should be rejected. FDA fills in the blanks, essentially with regulations and with guidance, but it needs to follow that determination by Congress of what degree of evidence is needed to approve a product. Essentially, it comes down to the strength of the evidence, with FDA taking into consideration the severity of the illness, the unmet need for therapies. Inspections of facilities are also part of FDA's job. They're going to look at the facility where the product's going to be made and decide whether the developer can make the product safely in that facility. You do sometimes see inspections derail product approvals, particularly with biologics, which can be difficult to manufacture. Finally, again, to give patients and to give industry more predictability and certainty about when a product may be coming onto the market, FDA commits to reviewing applications within certain deadlines. So for standard products, that's a 12-month time frame. For products that are novel, that would address our substantial advances over existing therapies, FDA commits to reviewing and making a decision, not necessarily approving, but making a decision within 8 months. For certain kinds of products, when they're truly breakthroughs for a particular condition, they do review in a much shorter time. If you see the term PDUFA deadline, that's what this is. It's simply the acronym for for the legislation that allows FDA to collect fees from industry and to commit to these deadlines. Next slide. So I just want to address a couple of points here that I think are sometimes sources of misunderstanding for folks who are looking from the outside in to FDA's actions, activities, decision-making. First is that, this may be obvious, but FDA follows US law, as I said. So the approval standards that FDA follows differ from those of other countries, sometimes similar, but often there are pathways or considerations FDA can take advantage of or other countries can take advantage of that FDA can't. That can produce a different regulatory result and a lot of sometimes confusion and misunderstanding. For example, when a product is approved first outside the US and not in the US. But again, it's because Congress sets the rules, FDA operates within those, and those laws are US laws. A second point that I think leads to a considerable amount of consternation is the third bullet I have on here. FDA has restrictions in law about what it can share with the public, what it knows, even when it knows things about drug applications that are sitting in front of it. So even the fact that an application is pending with the agency is considered to be confidential commercial information. If the drug developer decides it wants to make that information public, FDA can, but otherwise it's considered to be information that FDA is not able to share. You see sometimes when stakeholders, whether it's the drug developer or others involved in the process, maybe you're portraying study results or other important information in a certain way, and then you see silence from the FDA. You can get a lot of confusion out there. The facts tend to come to light in time, but this is sometimes an impediment to a clear conversation about what's pending at the agency, what the considerations are for a drug that may or may not be approved. It's a limiting factor. It's just something to be aware of, that the agency does have these constraints it's operating under. And then I'll just point out the last bullet on here, because I do think this sometimes gets portrayed inaccurately in the popular press. Sometimes you hear about decisions being made at FDA and the assumption is, well, this product was approved or not approved based on the administration that's in charge of the US government at the time, or based on who's leading the FDA at the moment. Certainly, administrations have an impact on the culture and the tone of the agency, but actual medical product decisions, with very few exceptions, are made by career staff at the agency. These are the physicians, statisticians, chemists, pharmacologists. On the device side, engineers are the folks making the final call on what products come on the market or not. Next slide. So why advocate? Why approach the FDA with what you would like to change? I guess, two reasons, very simply, because it matters and because it works. FDA is where the action is when it comes to getting therapies on the market. They are the gatekeepers. Certainly lots of patient organizations, patient advocates very rightly engage with the NIH. That's an important point of advocacy. It's essential, but I would argue not sufficient. The clarity and predictability of the pathways that FDA uses to move products through to patients are critical, and advocates' focus on that, I think I would argue, is essential. Certainly, there are lots of other folks engaged in that sphere, industry, consumer organizations, and their voices are important ones, but they often are aligned with patient organizations in many respects. But I would say they are different voices and different perspectives, and the patient voice is still needed in that space. And as I said before, advocacy works. It is far from perfect. There are failures, but there are also successes. FDA is and has been shaped by patient demands, certainly over the past 40 years. You can see some of these slides. I think some folks on the call may have been participants in some of these activities. but even in just the past, couple of decades that I've been watching this, you see a substantial increase in FDA's efforts to solicit patient views on important topics and to incorporate patient perspectives into their medical product decision-making, and you see successes for patients in influencing FDA's work. Next slide. So what makes for successful advocacy? Very basic one, use your own voice. I do sometimes see hesitance from some patient organizations. They see very polished, very technically specific presentations from industry and feel like maybe theirs isn't sufficient. It's not enough. It needs to look like something else. It's not the case. Absolutely, FDA needs to hear from industry, but they need to hear from patients. They need to hear from patients the burden of the disease. They need to hear from patients what you care about in terms of risks and benefits. They need to hear from patients about what communities you see are not being well served. Absolutely, you need to think about creating opportunities, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but I would urge you to take full advantage of the formal opportunities that already exist. And some of these are available at the link that I put up here, whether that's patient-focused drug development programs, which I know some folks on this call have participated in, patient listening sessions, advisory committee meetings, commenting on guidance documents. Those are all opportunities to have your voice heard. And then this may be an obvious one, but joining forces, both with others with the same diseases and conditions, but also with patient organizations outside of yours. There are a lot of areas of alignment, concern about obviously diversity in clinical trials, concern about flexibility in clinical trial design. Joining together with others inside and outside the community absolutely can increase your effectiveness in advocating with the agency. And then real quickly, next slide. So in addition to directly advocating with FDA, I think it's important to understand the significant other influencers of FDA's work. Two main ones, the administration and Congress. I know FDA sometimes seems like it's its own entity, but it actually sits within the Department of Health and Human Services, just like the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services and the National Institutes of Health. It is a sub-agency under that. Its work is overseen in many important ways, including on guidance document development by HHS, by the White House. They review those policy documents and they expect FDA to contribute to those HHS and White House priorities, which include for this administration, health equity and fostering biomedical innovation. Similarly, with Congress, you have individual members of Congress and committees with jurisdiction over FDA who are key stakeholders for the FDA. They get to decide what level of funding the agency gets. They get to decide what new pieces of legislation they can pass to direct FDA to do certain things, to stop doing certain things, to change what they're doing. They confirm commissioners, so they have a tremendous amount of leverage over the agency's operations. And when members of Congress let the agency know that it cares about something, it's not as though the agency, if it's something that they can't do or it's something that would be inappropriate to do, they still need to follow the science. But it's important for them to understand, and they try to be responsive to where they can those interests of stakeholders like members of Congress. So as you're thinking about your priorities, as you're pulling together all the thoughts that you heard from the conversation today, it is again useful, I think, to think about those external points of leverage and how you might be able to maximize your impact there. And then real quickly, let me just close with some successes and some opportunities. These are examples of the kinds of things that patient organizations and individual patients have helped to change, to add, to reconstruct at the agency. New and revised guidances on drug development, a push for innovative clinical trial designs, push for more inclusive clinical trials, changes to the way that FDA thinks about risk-benefit assessments, public-private partnerships for research on regulatory science. All of these are outcomes of patient advocacy. All of these are possibilities that can be pursued and have been pursued in the past with success. So I know we're over time. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions if there are folks still on the line.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dee. I'm going to invite all of our speakers and panelists to come on video, and we're going to close out with one question for all of you to answer very briefly, if you will. Just a couple of closing housekeeping notes. I want to say a sincere thanks to all of our speakers and panelists, as well as our attendees for joining today's webinar. We hope that you all found this information helpful. If you want to learn more, or surely we'll be sending out a recording of the webinar, feel free to reach out to us. Our emails are listed on the screen, and we'll also follow up by email. And so I want to close with a question to all of our speakers and panelists. And that question is, what's one key message that you would give to patients who are wanting to improve clinical trial access and equity? And all of you have brought different perspectives to this conversation today. So I'm looking to wrap us up by really highlighting all of those various perspectives. So what's one key message? And we're just going to go around the Zoom room. Lee, would you like to start?
Yes, one thing that I think is try to increase health literacy around clinical trials to understand what's going on with them. One great way to do that is finding what's called plain language summaries of clinical trials. Those are required in the European Union and the UK. So a lot of those are available. If you just do a search for them, you can take a look at those and get a really good idea of how clinical trials are being ran and what a participant or patient experiences in a clinical trial.
Fantastic. Plain language summaries. If you want more information about what that is, we'll give you Lee's contact information. Rico, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I think that, my, best advice would be to, maybe participate, in a community advisory board and learn about what community advisory boards are existing in your communities or your nearby communities. And I think that's, for me, at least when I first got involved in HIV vaccine trial work, that was the way that I learned, the ropes and learned kind of, the in and outs of, what it's like to be a participant. And so, walking through kind of the protocols, how to read a protocol, how to understand consent forms, like those sort of things, I think has been very, very helpful.
Fantastic. Tatiana, over to you.
I think as a clinical person, as a provider, as a message maybe to other providers, to really make sure to try to give this information to all of your patients. Don't assume that someone may not be interested in participating or, whatever it is. So our job is to make sure that we inform our patients, and we need to inform all of our patients about the possibilities.
And last but not least, Jeannie.
I would say to bring your knowledge of the barriers, the challenges, your solutions to your member of Congress, because at this moment, there is the highest level of interest I have certainly ever seen in this issue. There is legislation pending in Congress. So Congress is considering, but hasn't decided if it's going to move forward on legislation that would strengthen, maybe take a couple of steps further from that guidance document that FDA put out, even stronger, more directive language to companies about what they need to do. It's sitting at Congress right now. There's a moment. There's a very clear, I think, moment in time to move forward, and I think it's in the next couple of months.
Wonderful. Jason, I know that you have to drop off. I see you're unmuted. Any last parting words for the group?
Yes, I agree with with Lee Holland that, it should be in plain language. And not only that, to make sure that patients are being enrolled in the correct study and not just being enrolled into clinical trials just so that the organization keep the numbers up. I think that it's important because clinical trials can not only benefits the entire community that it's representing, but it can also be draining on the patient's mind. And if they're not prepared for that because they were given incorrect information, then that's a devastation to the whole study. And so I just hope that they keep that in mind. But other than that, had a wonderful time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason. And again, thank you to all of our speakers and panelists for joining us today and all of our participants. I really appreciate you hanging in there with us an extra 9 minutes. And with that, we'll follow up with the recording and the slides, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.